Alex, 2023 is expected to see M&A come back. As we look to the political environment, a lot of things will be happening in Europe, the UK. How might this impact acquirers and acquirees in their thinking and what they can do?
I think there are three big drivers for people to think about. The first we've already seen quite profoundly in 2022. The impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine means that money coming from Russia or CIS countries is looked at very closely. People have different overlapping sanctions regimes, but in the end, if you're doing deals in these markets, you're going to fall into at least one of them. And if you're looking at a business that does work in the US, then you're likely to be affected by the US's sanctions regime, which is the most stringent. So if you're thinking about how those things fall, it's best to look at what the kind of most robust sanctions regime is and almost assume that it applies to you. The second is demonstrated in the UK as well as in the US quite profoundly with increased scepticism about money coming from China. The UK's decision to reverse the admission of Huawei into our 5G national infrastructure is the most high profile, but by no means the only demonstration of scepticism about investment coming from China or China-related businesses. And we're only going to see, I think, more activity in that space. So the Biden administration has just said that American suppliers can't continue to supply Huawei. If you think about how that affects M&A, people are going to start having to think about what comes next. What will the next provision be? What will the next restriction politically be? Which might affect the value of the asset I'm looking at, or even stymie its ability to operate. And if it loses its ability to operate, then I might be left with something that looks very valuable now, but could be, on paper, worthless, have almost no throughput on its business in a few quarters' time. So for that reason, people have either got to be well informed in-house and doing their research about what's happening politically, use an agency like ours and think about what's coming next, or work hard through their trade association to try to establish what they think the next threat is. The trouble is trade associations very often have memberships which are so diffuse and have such different interests that they're doing really interesting and good work in other areas, but on this they may struggle. And the third area is national sovereignty in different ways. We're going to hear people talking about energy sovereignty and the ability to ensure that they can continue to supply energy in their markets and try to insulate themselves from pricing shocks. Food sovereignty, will this acquisition affect our ability to even feed our population, is the kind of things that people will be thinking about, and so forth. So in my market in the UK, the National Security and Investment Act is now in full force. Government's thinking about how the acquisition of assets affect the interests of UK PLC. It's not quite CFIUS in the US, but it's kind of like it. So it's not just markets anymore thinking, what's the value? The value is the value, that determines the deal. We're looking at broader kind of social ideas of value, up to and including national sovereignty issues, meaning a deal that would once have gone ahead, now can't.
Yeah, that makes sense, and we've touched on China, but one area of direction expected to be is US into UK, US into Europe. The strength of a greenback is quite astounding at the moment, but also the performance of US businesses haven't got quite the energy cost challenges which perhaps UK, European companies do, and private equity firms. There's some monsters floating around the US. So how do you think US into Europe will be perceived, and what do people need to consider from that aspect?
So we do a lot of inbound work in the European markets supporting M&A politically. And you're right, if certain markets like China or Russia are off limits or increasingly difficult to accept acquirers from, then you're likely to see more deal flow coming from the United States into continental Europe and the UK. That's not without challenges of its own. There are some things that are far more acceptable in the US than they are in European markets. At the extreme, things like genetic modification permitted in foodstuffs is completely mainstream in the US and banned in the EU. So there are things, there's, on that spectrum, there's lots in between totally acceptable and banned that mean that a US acquirer isn't necessarily straightforward either. You're often going to need to reassure the political audience on the European end that this isn't going to be some kind of rapacious deal that hollows out, takes all the value, strips it out, sells things for parts, and because of the increased ability of nation states to refuse offers and intervene, call things in and say you can't go ahead with that sale. You've got to be more and more attuned to the need to do the political groundwork and assure people that this M&A is for the long term. It's investment in a market rather than asset stripping. And so that's the second thing I would think about. But the third thing is that the American market is not functioning in the way that a lot of people were expecting coming into the Biden administration because of the energy issue you've already mentioned. The Biden administration told the fracking industry last year, stop at nothing to increase output, to increase production. That is not the discussion the environmental lobby thought they'd be having with the Biden White House. And it means that some people look askance at a potential American acquirer of a European business because they're undertaking, or they're fueled by activities that in the UK or Europe is far more controversial than it is in the US. So it's not straightforward, and you definitely have to do your political homework before going ahead with M&A.
No, that makes sense. And one thing we help people with a lot is takeover code, which is different in the UK, and I think American acquirers now understand that more.
Yeah.
There's some tricks and parts of it you have to be cognizant of. But one area which we do see people slightly confused about is what is support from governments going to look like in 2023? So obviously you've got subsidies in the US, there was support for energy in the UK and more broadly in Europe in 2022 for companies. When you look to see where the valuation might crystallise, that's a factor. What support do you think is going to come from governments this year?
So governments are more sceptical about continuing support because it's cost so much so far. You know, in my market in the UK, government's commitment to cap energy prices to households was the largest open-ended commitment made by government in financial terms in my life. Now, as it's turned out, it's not going to cost as much as they first thought because of the tumbling gas prices that we've seen since it was announced. And then they curtailed how long it would carry on for. But in principle, seeing governments make announcements like that is remarkable. And it's remarkable that the markets weren't more afraid of that kind of commitment from government. But on the other hand, what we saw during the brief Liz Truss Kwasi Kwarteng government in the UK was the markets reacting really badly to governments taking economic activity they didn't feel supportive about. And that means, and increasingly in the UK, where we're taxing more, we've seen an announcement from the IMF that anticipates the UK performing worse than other G7 economies. Governments obviously hate that. So they're going to be looking to things that they can do to trim the sails of those kinds of supports, limit government exposure. Now, they're going to carry on support to consumers where it's absolutely necessary. They'll carry on support to businesses when they have to. But the broad picture is government wanting to support people less and try to conserve fiscal resources in order to improve their standing internationally. After all, if your economy is performing poorly, you're not just doing badly domestically, and you're not just likely to lose elections, you're also less attractive internationally for investment. Because people think to themselves, it's not a growth economy, it's not a market that I see on the up and want to come to. So there's a kind of triple effect from poor economic performance. And some of that comes from big government announcements with open-ended commitments saying we're going to carry on spending X billion, or even we're going to carry on spending, but I don't know how many X billion it's going to cost yet. So I think that the theme is going to be into 2024, 2025, lower government commitments for that kind of activity. And there's one more piece that I think is also important in that. We are going to see increased investment in infrastructure assets, LNG ports, the ability to tidal, lagoon resources, solar energy, onshore wind. Governments across Europe are going to be doing more things to try to ensure their own energy sovereignty. And if you're investing in that, this is the real sweet spot for you. So you may see fewer government handouts to try and keep prices low, but if you're building the infrastructure, different story.